So in this segment, we're going to be discussing about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The border village is essentially being shelled, and they don't realise that Putin's to blame for the problems that they're facing now. Sorry if I sound frustrated. I had to re-record this. So this is great reporting here by Steve Rosenberg. So the sounds of war are becoming routine at this market a few miles inside Russia's border with Ukraine. The journalists can hear explosions in the distance, but no one flinches. Just meters away, other stalls have been reduced to twisted metal. They were hit by a mortar strike a few days ago. So we can see the Russian invasion of Ukraine is impacting places on the Russian side of the border, which I find surprising. I did not realise Ukraine had pushed so far in some areas, but these are mortar strikes, I think, which are generally not the most accurate, but weird that the West is reluctant to give Ukraine long-range weapons that could hit Russia directly, whilst Russia is being hit directly. But I guess there is a difference between the border areas being hit versus the Ukrainian military targeting Moscow. But yeah, it's all downhill from here, team. So you can see there's Belgorod here in grey. You got Kharkiv, which the Ukrainians have taken over. You've got Luhansk, where there's a lot of fighting, and you can see this is the border area where Ukraine would be fighting potentially, and so where you've got these lines in terms of limited military control. This is where potentially the shelling can happen, where they're trying to target Russians at the border, but it's going into the Russian side of the border. In many parts of Russia, this feels like a virtual war, a conflict being played out on the television from home, but in Russia's Belgorod region, war feels very real and real close. Reza Alexandra Drovona, who sells sweets here, has lost her sense of security. Quote, "No one is protecting us. When people go home at night, they don't know if they'll still be in one piece in the morning," end quote. Everyone the journalist speaks to at the market tells him that they live in fear of Ukrainian shelling, but they admit to mention it was the country that invaded Russia. It was their country. Quote, "We had to start this military operation," Reza insists. "It's the right thing. We should just have been better prepared for it. We should have drafted more people into the army right away. So many of our young men are dying. There will be no one left for our women to marry." But what about the Ukrainians who've been killed because of Russia's invasion, he asks. Quote, "Yes, of course, people on both sides have been killed, but the minds of Ukrainians have been altered. A new generation that has grown up there hating Russians, we need to re-educate them, remake them," end quote. So this is the case. This case shows that people in the village have some issues. They acknowledge that they have been suffering due to the war directly, as they know that people, as they know people on their side of the border may have been killed by the shelling, and their houses and businesses could get hit, as already some have been hit. The lady insists that they had to start the war to free people of Ukraine because they have been, quote, brainwashed. They believe that Ukraine hates Russia, which I doubt was the case before the war. If you think about it, Russia has been in kind of a proxy war with Ukraine for a long time now over some of the border areas and, of course, Crimea. This lady accepts there's deaths on both sides, or you could say kills on both sides, but the, quote, need to re-educate Ukrainians is so great that they're happy to sacrifice the lives of other Russian kind of men, in this case, and their own safety in this border area over this. This is the power of propaganda. Given that some people in Russia see Ukraine as part of Russia, you can see why this sort of propaganda can be so powerful. Russia have convinced people that this is essentially a war to liberate what they see as part of Russia, which we know isn't the case. Ukraine is its own sovereign nation. But with a constant stream of propaganda being fed to them and the history of the two nations, you can see why this sort of thing has taken a hold. In the city of Belgorod, the regional capital, a letter Z, the symbol of Russia's military operation, has been erected along a busy highway. In recent months, there have been explosions, two in Belgorod, including at the airport, an oil depot, and an apparent strike on a power plant. Suddenly, residents are having to think about where to take cover. Shelters have been opened in cellars and in basements of apartment blocks. Conversations here run similar to the ones at the market, with most people telling the journalists, yes, security only became a problem after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but no, they don't blame the invasion themselves. It's as if there's a psychological firewall protecting people from connecting the deteriorating security situation to the decision of their president. It seems like it could be a range of things here. Perhaps people in the area thought that Ukraine hated Russia so much that Ukraine would invade Russia at some point, or perhaps Ukraine would be a launching pad of a potential NATO invasion if Ukraine became a part of NATO. Perhaps they thought this situation is inevitable or a worthy sacrifice. It's hard to know without being able to talk to people on the ground. Staring down from billboards and advertising hoardings in Belgrade are the portraits of decorated Russian soldiers who have been fighting in Ukraine. The images of the slogans encourage the people to rally around the flag. Thank you for your heroic deeds, for the motherland. Everything for the front line, everything for victory. Believe in yourself, but live for Russia. In addition to the slogans on the street, there are also propaganda on Russian state TV. From morning till night, news bulletins and talk shows assure viewers that Russia is in the right and Ukraine and the West are the aggressors, and that in this conflict, the future of Russia is at stake. This is a clear effort to keep people from turning against the Russian government, everything for this war for the state. Putin has portrayed this war as a necessity for Russia, and that means people have to make sacrifices. This war has been portrayed as a defensive war or a war of liberation, almost both at the same time. Quote, to defend the Ukrainians from the West and the Nazis, but also to bring them back into the Russian fold, end quote. This kind of defensive war has been in the mind of Russia for centuries, that other nation states will invade them. Putin has instilled the need to sacrifice everything, just like the USSR did during the Nazi invasion of Ukraine. This is what is mentioned in the article, and by couching it like this, it reminds people of the sacrifices of the greatest generation, the ones who sacrificed so much to fight the Nazis. By greatest generation, I'm referring to the ones who fought the fascists, regardless of their nationality or ethnicity. And Putin is using their sacrifice to put into the hearts of his people that they can be like that greatest generation, and is using this to instigate an offensive war. That fear of invasion runs deep within Russia, for Putin to convince people that the sacrifice that Russians are being asked to make today, by comparing it back with World War II, for anyone that believes that no sacrifice would be too great for them. And obviously this makes no sense given the context I've already given you. And that's what, to an extent, we are seeing in some parts of Russia. On the front, I think propaganda isn't working as much, but within Russia it has worked to an extent, and that's the power of propaganda. It's a nasty work, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the video. In Belgrade, knitting shops, I get chatting to the owner, the journalist does. He clearly believes that by criticising Russia, the West is pulling the wool over everyone's eyes. Quote, the West plays a negative role, he tells me. Quote, it obviously wants to destroy Russia. We've seen that before under Adolf Hitler, end quote. And to class Nazi Germany as the West is a bit of a weird statement. Definitely would not have classed them as part of the West. Very strange. But Hitler has been dead for a long time. If the West wanted to destroy Russia, countries like Germany and Italy would not have brought so much Russian gas and oil. They would have made deals with countries like Qatar way before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But this is clearly the angle Putin is going for. Putin has claimed that Ukraine is being run by Nazis or something similar to that. So by attacking Ukraine first, they can avoid a mythical Nazi Ukraine attacking Russia, which is run by a person of Jewish heritage. Like, give me a break, people. Not everyone shares the views of that person mentioned above, are willing to admit in public that they are against the war. Quote, I don't believe I can influence this situation, end quote, says Ivan further up the street. Quote, I understand which country I'm living in and what the authorities have done to prevent ordinary people from expressing their opinions, such as, and any such expression is dangerous, end quote. And they can't be open with their opinions. Putin hates dissent at the best of times. But in war, where Russia is struggling, most countries clamp down on dissent, or used to back in the last century. Not so much now. But Putin does live in the last century with his old imperialist mentality and Cold War era weapons. But at least there are some people who can see through the nonsense. And people ask the ones that are against the war to protest and riot more, but that's a one-way ticket to going to jail with a beating or being sent to the front. We've also seen people lose their employment over this. References to Hitler are not an accident. You hear them all the time, on Russian TV to spark patriotic fervour and boost public support for the, quote, special military operation. The Kremlin paints the war in Ukraine in similar colours as World War II, as Russia is fighting fascism, battling to defend the motherland from foreign invaders, which makes no sense. And Russia suffered a lot during World War II. We can say Stalin siding with the fascists, with the Nazi-Soviet pact was a horrible move. But given the West saw Nazi Germany as a buffer against the USSR, let's not point too many fingers. But Russia was invaded and occupied by the Nazis, and Putin keeps using this in his case for an offensive war. Crazy that some people in Russia don't understand this. World War II and the invasion of Ukraine are very different. Some Nazis with the Azov battalion are very different to a full-on Nazi Germany. In a wasteland outside Belgrade, the journalist sees firsthand how connections to World War II are being created. A group of armed men have agreed to meet him. They call themselves Smersh, death to spies, after a notorious counterintelligence unit created by Joseph Stalin in World War II. They will not reveal their faces or their names, but they will talk briefly about their activities. Quote, at the moment, we are training a territorial defense force for Belgorod region, one man says. Quote, some of those in training have experience in fighting, some are former police and ex-military. They will defend the Belgorod region if there is an attack on Russia. As for us, we will carry out any task the commander-in-chief may give us in any town in the world, end quote. And you have this lot cosplaying, playing Dad's Army, playing war here, but Ukraine most likely won't invade Russia. Their focus will be taking back land and the ports, and then figuring out how to take back Crimea, which will be pretty difficult. Among the men being trained is Evgeny Bakalo, a local writer and businessman in Belgorod. Evgeny has set up a support group for Ukrainians who crossed into Russia to escape the war. Mr. Bakalo's opinion of Ukraine chimes with the opinions of President Putin. Quote, we are one people. Ukrainians are Russians. They've just forgotten about it, end quote. And they clearly want to be two separate people. At least Ukraine does want to be separate from Russia. No matter how close two countries are via culture and language, they might want to keep themselves as separate countries. If Ukraine wanted to be a part of Russia, this war would be over and Russia would have won extremely quickly. But that has not happened. You'll also see mass surrender from any Ukrainian who was drafted into the defense of Ukraine, but that has not happened. The Ukrainian people value their sovereignty and independence and are determined not to be forced back into Moscow's orbit. Meanwhile, Moscow continues to portray Ukrainian officials as neo-Nazis and Western governments as Nazi sympathizers, another reason for the Kremlin's frequent references to the 1940s. And again, this argument does not make sense, but you can see why Russia would make it. The Azov Battalion were upgraded to be called the Azov Regiment. A regiment is around 800 troops. Ukraine has a military now of 500,000. So the Azov Battalion, and the Azov Battalion also has a political wing who have won 15,000 votes, which is way too much for scum like them. But that's 2.15% of the popular vote, which has won them a whopping 0 seats in the Ukrainian election in 2019. And if the fear is this, like, we're going to invade Russia, they couldn't even take back, parts of Luhansk and Donetsk or even Crimea during the Civil War. They still have no chance of invading Russia, but Russia used this battalion in the propaganda wars. Post-war, this battalion or regiment has to be disbanded, but for Russia to claim this lot were a major threat to Russia or that they were brainwashing Ukraine makes no sense given the evidence I've given you already. Under President Putin, the national idea is constructed around World War II, what most Russians refer as the Great Patriotic War. Both the Soviet Union's victory in that war and the enormous human cost of that victory is a huge emotive factor. And this is where it gets really dark, in my opinion. Olga, who runs a church in Belgorod, tells me she's very frightened when the city is being shelled. When the journalist suggests that this wouldn't be happening if the, quote, special military operation hadn't started, her immediate reaction is to reference World War II. Quote, I return us to the Great Patriotic War, Olga tells me, which was a time of great sacrifice. There are great sacrifices being made when our men go off to fight. They know the men may be killed. End quote. Olga's husband isn't at home. He volunteered to fight in the special military operation. She accepts the official view, the version of events that many of the world dismisses the Kremlin's alternative reality. Quote, Russia didn't provoke this war, Olga tells the journalist. A Russian will give you the shirt off his back. Russia didn't attack Ukraine. Russians are peace-loving and generous, end quote. And the thing is, Russia did provoke this war. This was the invasion of another country. That's generally how you start a war, or how a war started. Putin's brainwashing is so strong that this lady has rationalised her husband fighting and potentially dying in a foreign land in a war that makes no sense for Russia. The husband who was convinced that Russia was facing a World War II level threat. This is the power of propaganda. A man who was convinced of a threat that did not exist to the extent he volunteered to join the military and potentially be killed.
Tomorrow, there will be no shortage of volunteers. No shortage of patriots.
And a wife who accepted this outcome, both because they were convinced they have to make the same sacrifices the greatest generation made. But they can't see that in this story they're the villains. Propaganda is just that powerful at times, and no one is safe from it. But anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.